Look at them. Somewhere out there in that ocean of firelight, the greatest military machine in the known world is moving. The Ottoman Empire, at its peak. 300,000 soldiers, artillery that can level city walls, an administration so efficient it could supply armies across 3 continents simultaneously. And they are coming here. They are coming for one small, battered principality sandwiched between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River, a place called Wallachia. They have swallowed kingdoms before. Hungary, gone. Bulgaria, gone. Serbia, gone. They have stood at the gates of Vienna and made the Holy Roman Emperor sweat. And yet, standing between that empire and total domination of Eastern Europe is one man. A man born a bastard who bribed his way onto the throne. He outmaneuvered every kingdom in the region, and then, with an army a fraction of the Ottoman force, did something no one believed was possible. His name was Mihai Viteazul, Micheal the Brave. And this is his story. To understand Micheal the Brave, you first have to understand the world that made him. And that world, in the mid-16th century, was a world on fire. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent had reached its apex. It controlled territory stretching from Vienna in the northwest to Baghdad in the east, from North Africa in the south to the Crimean steppe in the north. It was the richest, most powerful state in the world, and it wanted more. Between the Ottomans and the heart of Christian Europe sat 3 small principalities: Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania. These were not mighty kingdoms, they were buffer zones, trapped, each one technically a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, required to pay annual tribute in gold, grain, and boys taken as slaves. If they paid and submitted, the Ottomans largely left them alone. If they resisted, if they even looked like they were resisting, the Janissaries came. Wallachia sat directly in the Ottoman crosshairs. It bordered the Danube to the south, sharing that river border directly with Ottoman-controlled Bulgaria. To the north, the Carpathian Mountains provided some natural defense. To the west and east, political chaos and shifting allegiances. The throne of Wallachia, called the Voivode, was not a hereditary monarchy. It was contested, brutally, constantly, lethally contested. The Wallachian nobility, the boyars, had enormous power to support or topple rulers, and the Ottomans, for their part, were happy to sell the throne to whoever paid the most and promised the most. The average reign of a Wallachian voivode, less than 3 years. Most ended with the ruler fleeing into exile or losing his head. It was into this world, treacherous, violent, impermanent, that Micheal was born. Around 1558, his mother was Theodora, a woman of some noble lineage. His father, almost certainly Petrascu the Good, a former voivode of Wallachia. But Michael's claim was never formally acknowledged. In the language of the era, he was a bastard, a son whose legitimacy would always be questioned. That uncertainty would define him and drive him. We know frustratingly little about Micheal's childhood. The historical record for this period in Wallachia is thin. What we can piece together gives us a picture of a young man moving in the dangerous currents of Wallachian court politics from an early age. Micheal was raised in an environment where intelligence and adaptability were not just virtues, they were survival skills. He almost certainly received a solid education. He would have been taught in the Orthodox Christian tradition, learned to read and write in Church Slavonic, and likely learned Greek as well. Greek literacy was more significant than it might sound. Constantinople, though fallen to the Ottomans, remained the cultural and religious center of the Orthodox world. The Phanariot Greeks served as crucial intermediaries between the Wallachian nobility and the Ottoman court. To navigate that world, you needed Greek. Micheal had it. In his youth and young adulthood, Micheal held a series of minor administrative and trade-related positions. He appears to have spent time in the mercantile world, possibly involved in cattle trading, one of Wallachia's most profitable industries. This gave him something that pure court politicians lacked, an understanding of commerce, of money. He was also, by all accounts, physically formidable. Multiple contemporary sources describe him as tall, powerfully built, with a presence that commanded attention. He was a skilled horseman and fighter from an early age. In a world where personal military leadership was still the norm, this mattered enormously. But physical courage without political intelligence was just a quick way to get killed in 16th century Wallachia. Micheal learned both. Section 1C, the climb to power. By the late 1580s, Micheal was in his late 20s and clearly ambitious. He had connections to the Wallachian nobility, some wealth from his business activities, and the bloodline of a former voivode. He began making his moves. Around 1588, Micheal was appointed Ban of Mehedinti, essentially the military governor of a border region. This was his first real position of power, and it put him in command of troops and resources. He used the position well, demonstrating administrative ability and military competence. But Wallachia's politics were moving fast. Rulers were coming and going. In 1593, the reigning voivode Alexandru cel Rau was deeply unpopular. Micheal moved. He traveled to Constantinople, the lion's den itself, and negotiated directly with the Ottoman court. He paid, in modern terms, an enormous bribe, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 gold coins. Some of this was borrowed, some from his own accumulated wealth, some from supporters who believed he was the right man. In exchange, the Ottomans recognized Micheal as voivode of Wallachia. In September 1593, he returned to Wallachia and took the throne. Alexandru fled. Micheal the Brave, at around 35 years old, was now the ruler of Wallachia. Many assumed he would be just another Ottoman puppet, paying his tribute and bowing his head like the others. They had misread him catastrophically. The moment Micheal took the throne, he began preparing for war. Not defensive war, offensive war. This requires explanation, because on the surface it makes no rational sense. He was a new ruler with a disputed claim, heavily in debt, with a small and poorly equipped army, surrounded by the most powerful empire in the world. Why would he pick a fight? The answer is a combination of strategic calculation, personal conviction, and external opportunity. First, the strategic calculation. The Ottoman tribute system was grinding Wallachia into poverty. Every year, gold, grain, cattle, and children left the principality. The economy was being hollowed out. The nobles were restless. The peasants were desperate. Continuing to submit was not a stable long-term strategy. Second, the external opportunity. In 1593, the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II had just launched the long Turkish war against the Ottomans. The papacy had been working to assemble what it called the Holy League, a coalition of Christian states to push back against Ottoman expansion. Micheal saw an alliance opportunity. If he joined the Habsburgs, he would no longer be fighting alone. Third, Micheal seems to have had a genuine sense of mission. He was a devout Orthodox Christian. He saw himself as a defender of his people and his faith. The tribute of children to Ottoman service was not an abstraction to him. These were real boys, taken from real villages, converted to Islam and trained as janissaries to fight against their own people. That burned him. In late 1594, Micheal made his move. He signed a formal alliance with the Holy League, joining Emperor Rudolf II, Prince Sigismund Bathory, and Voivode Aron Tiranul. In a coordinated anti-Ottoman effort, then in November 1594 he struck. Micheal's first act of open rebellion was breathtaking in its audacity and precision. Ottoman merchants and creditors, living under assumption of protection, were systematically killed in a coordinated assassination campaign. Thousands were killed in a single night. Micheal eliminated his debts, demonstrated to his people that the Ottoman yoke was being thrown off. It was ruthless. It was calculated. And it sent a shockwave through Constantinople. He then moved immediately to military action, understanding the Ottomans' response would be swift and overwhelming. He launched raids across the Danube into Ottoman-held Bulgaria, striking at supply depots, fortresses, and garrisons. His forces captured and briefly held Giurgiu, the key Danubian fortress directly opposite Bucharest. They pushed into the Dobrogea region. These were not just symbolic strikes. They disrupted Ottoman supply lines. At the same time, Micheal sent urgent diplomatic messages to his allies. He needed the Habsburgs and Transylvanians to move, to create a multi-front problem for the Ottomans, to prevent the full weight of the empire from falling on his small principality alone. The coordination was imperfect, but it worked well enough. By 1595, Michael had stabilized his position. He repelled initial Ottoman counterattacks and demonstrated to both his enemies and his allies that he was a serious military and political force. Here is where we need to pause the military narrative for a moment, because Michael's true genius was not just on the battlefield. It was in intelligence and diplomacy, in understanding the information environment and manipulating it with exceptional skill. Michael maintained an extraordinarily sophisticated network of spies and informants throughout the region. He had contacts inside Ottoman Bulgaria who fed him information about troop movements, supply levels, and military preparations. He had agents in the Ottoman court itself, facilitated by his earlier time in Constantinople and his connections to the Greek Phanariot community. He received early warnings of major Ottoman campaigns, giving him crucial preparation time. He also ran what we would today call active deception operations. He spread deliberate misinformation about the size and readiness of his forces. He used diplomatic channels to suggest he might be open to negotiation, buying time while actually preparing offensive operations. He played the Habsburg Emperor and the Transylvanian Prince against each other, ensuring neither could afford to abandon him. His understanding of the Ottoman administrative structure was particularly sharp. He knew it was not a monolith. It was a complex organism with competing factions, ambitious pashas, and political pressure points. When he needed to buy time, he sent envoys with gifts to specific Ottoman officials, not the Sultan, but those who moved the bureaucratic machinery. He knew who was susceptible to flattery, who could be bribed, who had rivals that could be quietly encouraged. He was equally shrewd in his dealings with the Transylvanian nobility, who were deeply suspicious of a Wallachian ruler gaining too much power. Michael cultivated personal relationships with key Transylvanian lords, understood their economic interests, and framed his military requests in terms of their self-interest. His relationship with the Habsburg Empire was masterfully managed. Michael presented himself to Emperor Rudolf II as the essential bulwark against Ottoman expansion. He leveraged this positioning to extract military subsidies, weapons, and diplomatic support. At the same time, he never allowed himself to become entirely dependent on Habsburg goodwill. He maintained back-channel communications with the Ottomans, ensuring that both the Habsburgs and the Ottomans believed he had viable alternatives. This ambiguity was not weakness, it was leverage. Here's a question for you watching right now. Do you think Michael's willingness to play every side against each other was genius, or was it a moral compromise that ultimately cost him? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. The Ottomans were not amused, and they were not slow. By late 1594 and into 1595, the Ottoman Grand Vizier Koka Sinan Pasha was organizing a massive punitive expedition against Wallachia. Sinan Pasha was a veteran commander. He had led Ottoman forces in North Africa, Hungary, and elsewhere. He understood that Michael's rebellion, if left unchecked, could inspire similar revolts. The force assembled was enormous. Contemporary sources vary, but a reasonable estimate suggests Sinan Pasha crossed the Danube with somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 men. The core of the force were the Janissaries, the Ottoman Empire's elite infantry, professional soldiers who had been trained since childhood, disciplined and feared throughout the known world. There were approximately 10,000 to 15,000 Janissaries in this force, equipped with both firearms, matchlock arquebuses, and traditional weapons including swords and bows. The Sipahis, Ottoman cavalry drawn from the landed military class, formed a large portion of the mounted force. These were experienced, well-equipped horsemen who provided both shock capability and rapid flanking maneuvers. Estimates place their numbers at 20,000 to 30,000. Auxiliary forces, Tatar cavalry from the Crimean Khanate, Balkan levies and vassal contingents made up the bulk of the remaining numbers. Critically, Sinan Pasha brought artillery. Ottoman cannon technology was formidable. They had, after all, used it to shatter the walls of Constantinople in 1453. The artillery train accompanying this force included dozens of pieces ranging from light field guns to heavier siege artillery. Micheal watched all of this unfold through his intelligence network and knew exactly what was coming. He could not match this force in open battle on flat ground. He needed to choose his ground and choose it brilliantly. August 1595. The Ottoman juggernaut has crossed the Danube and is advancing north into Wallachia. Sinan Pasha commands a force estimated at 100,000 to 150,000 men. Micheal the Brave has, at most, 16,000 soldiers, possibly as few as 10,000, depending on which source you trust. He is outnumbered somewhere between 7 to 1 and 15 to 1. Let that sink in for a moment. 7 to 15 men against every one of Micheal's. In any normal calculation, this is not a battle. This is an execution. Micheal did not think in normal calculations. He studied the terrain between the Danube and his capital, Târgoviște, and identified the one place in Wallachia where his numerical disadvantage could be neutralized, or at least reduced to something survivable. That place was Calugăreni. In Romanian, the name means the monk's place. It sat in a narrow marshy valley carved by the Neajlov River, roughly halfway between the Danube and Târgoviște. The valley was flanked on both sides by dense forest and boggy ground. The approach through the valley was so narrow that even an enormous army could only deploy a fraction of its force at any given time. Micheal understood something fundamental about the coming battle. He could not win. He could not defeat Sinan Pasha's entire army. What he could do was bleed it, hurt it badly enough that it would be weakened and demoralized by the time his allied reinforcements arrived from Transylvania. He was buying time with blood, and he calculated precisely how much time he needed and how much blood he could afford. Micheal's army at Calugăreni was a diverse and fascinating force, not a standard feudal levy. It was a carefully assembled coalition of different fighting types, each chosen for specific tactical purposes. The Wallachian infantry, called pedestrasi or dorobanti, formed the backbone. These were foot soldiers. Drawn from the free peasantry and minor nobility, they fought primarily with spears, halberds, and bows. Though some units were being equipped with firearms, their discipline was variable, but their motivation was high. They were defending their homes. The cavalry, called kalari, were Wallachian horsemen, lighter and more maneuverable than Ottoman sipahis. Excellent raiders and skirmishers, less suited to pitched charges. Micheal had a corps of Sziekler cavalry from Transylvania, skilled Hungarian ethnic soldiers, among the finest light cavalry in Europe. Their integration was a fruit of his alliance with Sigismund Bathory. He also had a contingent of Cossack infantry and cavalry, fighters from the Ukrainian steppe. Experienced, tough, and comfortable with the kind of loose, terrain-exploiting warfare that Micheal needed. Cossacks had an intimate understanding of fighting larger forces through mobility and ambush. Micheal had some artillery, a small number of field guns, perhaps a dozen pieces. Nothing approaching the Ottoman artillery train in number or weight, but enough to be used tactically. Perhaps most importantly, Micheal himself commanded from the front. This was not ceremonial. He rode into the fighting personally, his presence serving to hold the line when it wavered. Contemporary accounts describe him fighting hand-to-hand in the midst of the battle. This personal courage was strategically significant, preventing morale collapse in a numerically inferior force. August 23, 1595. Dawn breaks over the Neajlov Valley. Micheal has positioned his force across the narrow defile, with the marshy ground and the river protecting his flanks. He knows the Ottomans are coming. He knows exactly how many there are. He has positioned his guns on the slight rising ground at the northern end of the valley. The Ottoman advance guard enters the valley first. These are not the full Janissary units. They are lighter forces, scouts and vanguard cavalry, testing the ground. Micheal's archers and musketeers fire from the flanking forest positions. Men fall. The vanguard falls back. Sinan Pasha is told the valley is contested. Sinan Pasha had two choices. He could go around, find another route north, which would add days to his march, and give Micheal's allies more time to arrive. Or he could force the valley. He chose to force it. He could not imagine that a force of 16,000 could hold against his army. He was wrong. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the standard Ottoman tactical playbook. The Janissaries, elite and formidable in open-field combat, found their advantages neutralized in the muddy, forested valley. They could not deploy in their full formations. Their cavalry, the mighty Sipahis, could barely maneuver in the boggy ground, flanking the narrow path. Michael's Wallachian and Cossack infantry contested every meter. When the Janissaries pushed forward, Michael's men fell back slightly, drawing them into terrain that favored defenders. When the Ottomans paused to regroup, Wallachian cavalry would probe the flanks, preventing the buildup of decisive pressure. Michael's artillery, small though it was, fired down the valley approach with devastating effect. The confined space amplified each shot. Cannonballs that would have dissipated in open ground tore through packed columns of men who had nowhere to spread out. The fighting was extraordinary in its intensity. Multiple chronicles agree that the hand-to-hand combat was among the most brutal of the Turkish war period. Michael himself reportedly killed several Ottoman commanders personally, including the leading commander of the Janissary vanguard, whom Michael cut down in the front lines. The Ottomans pushed again and again. Each time Michael's line bent but did not break. But the mathematics were inexorable. Sinan Pasha had a virtually unlimited supply of men to feed into the valley. Michael did not. Every casualty he suffered was irreplaceable. After approximately 8 hours of fighting, Michael made the decision to withdraw. His force was bloodied and at risk of being overwhelmed. As the Ottomans began finding their way around the flanking forest positions, a fighting retreat northward toward Targoviste and the Carpathian passes where Allied forces were gathering, what were the casualties? Here, the historical record requires honest handling, because the numbers in various chronicles are wildly contradictory, as they almost always are for pre-modern battles. For Michael's force, Romanian chronicles suggest he lost approximately 1,000 to 2,500 men killed, roughly 10% of his force. This is a heavy but not catastrophic loss for a defensive holding action. Given the numerical disparity, it was an extraordinary result. Ottoman casualties are far harder to establish. The Romanian chronicles claim very high Ottoman losses. Some suggest 10,000 to 15,000 killed. Ottoman sources acknowledge serious losses but give no specific numbers, which itself is telling. Armies don't omit casualty figures when those figures are small and flattering. The consensus among modern historians is that Ottoman losses were likely in the range of 5,000 to 8,000 men. Very serious numbers for what was supposed to be a walkover. Sinan Pasha's army, despite claiming the field, had been shaken. The battle they had expected to last an hour had lasted most of a day. The enemy they expected to scatter had fought them to a standstill and inflicted thousands of casualties, and Michael had withdrawn in good order, not routed, not destroyed, still dangerous. Sinan Pasha advanced to Targoviste and then to Bucharest, capturing both cities, both of which Michael had emptied of defenders and stripped of supplies before withdrawing. These were not cities worth dying for. The Ottomans held empty buildings. Meanwhile, the time Michael had bought at Kalugareni was now cashing in. Sigismund Bathory crossed the Carpathians with a Transylvanian army. Estimates suggest 40,000 to 50,000 men, including Habsburg-supported mercenary units with modern artillery. Michael linked up with these forces in the mountains. Now the balance shifted. The combined Wallachian-Transylvanian army descended on Sinan Pasha's forces in a series of engagements in September and October 1595. The battles of Teliagen, Giurgiu, and the crossing of the Danube forced the Ottoman army into an increasingly desperate situation. Sinan Pasha's massive force, which had advanced so confidently, was now fighting its way back to the Danube under constant harassment. At Giurgiu, the final engagement of the 1595 campaign, Michael's cavalry and Transylvanian artillery caught a major portion of the Ottoman army attempting to cross the Danube. The battle became a rout. Ottoman sources acknowledge the loss was severe. Romanian chronicles claim 20,000 to 30,000 Ottoman casualties. In the combined autumn campaign, almost certainly exaggerated, but indicative of a genuine military disaster, Sinan Pasha retreated back across the Danube. Wallachia was free, for now. Micheal the Brave had done something almost without precedent in this era. He had taken on the Ottoman Empire directly, held them at Kalugareni against impossible odds, and then driven them back. The news spread across Europe. In Vienna, in Rome, in Madrid, Christian rulers who had been watching the Ottoman advance with dread suddenly paid attention to this improbable prince from Wallachia. 6 months later, Micheal turned east. Moldavia, the third Romanian principality, sat to the northeast of Wallachia. It was bordered by Poland, the Ottoman Empire, and the Crimean Khanate. Its ruler, Ieremia Movila, was aligned with Poland, specifically with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth under Sigismund III Vasa, who had his own designs on Moldavia, and deep suspicions of Micheal's growing power. In May 1600, Micheal invaded Moldavia. His force was significant, reflecting the additional resources Transylvania's conquest had put at his disposal. The Moldavian military resistance was limited. Ieremia Movila fled to Poland. Micheal entered Iasi, the Moldavian capital, in late May 1600. For a brief, extraordinary moment, a matter of weeks, Micheal the Brave was the ruler of all three Romanian principalities: Wallachia, Transylvania, Moldavia. He used the title in documents as Voivode of Wallachia, Transylvania, and the whole of Moldavia. For the first time in history, the Romanian-speaking populations of the Carpathian and Danubian world were under a single ruler. Modern Romanian national history treats this moment as the first prototypical unification of Romania, a vision of what the Romanian state would eventually become in the 19th century. Whether Micheal himself conceived of it in national terms is debated, whether he was thinking ethnically or simply strategically. But the achievement was real, and its legacy proved lasting. The unified Romanian state lasted approximately 3 months in its fullest form before beginning to unravel. Understanding why requires understanding the political geography of early modern Eastern Europe. Micheal had made too many enemies too fast. The Transylvanian nobility, Hungarian and Saxon lords, deeply resented a Wallachian Orthodox prince ruling over them. They launched an internal rebellion almost immediately in coordination with external enemies. The Austrian Habsburg court grew alarmed by his rapidly expanding power. A Wallachian prince controlling Transylvania and Moldavia was no longer a useful tool. He was a potential rival. Poland, which had interests in Moldavia, was openly hostile. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth under Sigismund III moved to restore Movila to the Moldavian throne. In September 1600, a Polish and Cossack army invaded Moldavia and then struck into Wallachia. Micheal was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, without adequate resources. The fatal blow came at the Battle of Miroslav in September 1600. Transylvanian rebel forces, led by Sigismund Bathory, who had returned yet again, and supported by Habsburg General Giorgio Basta, defeated Micheal's army. Micheal lost Transylvania. Shortly after, he lost Moldavia to the Poles. And then, in November 1600, a coalition of Wallachian boyars rose against him, supported by the Ottomans. Micheal was driven from Wallachia itself. The man who had briefly ruled 3 principalities was suddenly a ruler without a throne, a general without an army, a diplomat without leverage. Micheal went to Vienna. He went to the court of Emperor Rudolf II and made his case in person. This required extraordinary self-possession. He was arriving as a defeated refugee, seeking help from an emperor who had partly contributed to his downfall. He dressed magnificently, presented himself with full princely dignity, and laid out a strategic argument for why restoring him served Habsburg interests. The argument was compelling. The Ottomans had taken back Wallachia. A pro-Ottoman ruler now sat in Târgoviște. The Habsburgs' buffer against Ottoman expansion had been eliminated. Restoring Micheal, the proven fighter, the man who had won at Kalugareni, served Rudolf's interests directly. Rudolf was persuaded, or rather, his military commanders were persuaded, and they persuaded him. Micheal was assigned to work with Habsburg General Giorgio Basta in Transylvania, the same Basta who had helped defeat him at Miroslav. This was a strained, deeply uncomfortable arrangement. Michael and Basta deeply distrusted each other, but they had a common enemy, Sigismund Bathory, who had returned to Transylvania again and needed to be dislodged. In the summer of 1601, Michael and Basta moved against Sigismund Bathory's forces in Transylvania. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Guruslau, fought on August 3, 1601, near the town of Guruslau in western Transylvania. Sigismund Bathory had assembled a force estimated at approximately 20,000 to 30,000 men, including Transylvanian cavalry, Cossack units in his own employ, and Ottoman allied Tatar cavalry. The Habsburg-Wallachian force under Michael and Basta numbered approximately 20,000 as well. Smaller Habsburg mercenary infantry, Michael's Wallachian cavalry, and Szekler units. The battle at Guruslau demonstrated Michael's tactical sophistication at its most refined. Sigismund's army was positioned on high ground, apparently an advantage. Michael and Basta attacked with a coordinated infantry-cavalry assault. The Habsburg mercenary infantry held the center and traded fire and blade with Sigismund's infantry. Michael personally led his Wallachian and Szekler cavalry in a sweeping flanking attack against the Transylvanian left wing. The flanking attack succeeded brilliantly. Michael's cavalry broke through the Transylvanian left, swung behind the main line, and created chaos in the rear. Sigismund's force caught between the frontal pressure of Basta's infantry, and the cavalry attack in their rear collapsed. Sigismund Bathory fled the field for what would prove to be the last time. His army disintegrated. Casualties in Sigismund's force are estimated at 5,000 to 8,000 killed, with many more captured or dispersed. It was a decisive tactical victory. Michael had won Transylvania back. Micheal the Brave's story ends not on a battlefield, but in a tent. After Guruslau, the relationship between Michael and Giorgio Basta deteriorated rapidly. Basta had watched Michael regain his position and his standing with the emperor. He had watched the Wallachian prince earn credit for the victory, and he deeply feared, with some justification, that Michael's ultimate goal was independence from Habsburg control, not service to it. The Habsburg court received reports, some accurate, some fabricated by his enemies, that Michael was in secret negotiations with the Ottomans and the Poles, that he was planning to betray the alliance once he had consolidated his position. Whether these reports were true in substance or not, they found receptive ears in Vienna. Among officials who had always been uneasy about Michael's power and independence. On August 9, 1601, just 6 days after Guruslau, Michael was summoned to a meeting with Basta and a group of Walloon mercenary soldiers. He came reportedly without significant personal guard. In the tent, he was surrounded and murdered. His head was severed from his body. He was 43 years old. The assassination was ordered, or at minimum enabled, by Giorgio Basta. Whether it had higher Habsburg authorization is unclear and disputed by historians to this day. What is clear is that Michael's murder was a political act, not a random killing. He was eliminated because he had become inconveniently powerful, inconveniently independent, and inconveniently popular among the Romanian populations of all three principalities. He was buried, his head and body eventually reunited, at the monastery of Dealu, near Târgoviște, a fitting resting place for a man whose life had orbited that city. His tomb became and remains a site of Romanian national pilgrimage. Micheal the Brave's military legacy is multifaceted and enduring. He demonstrated that a small, well-led force fighting on home terrain could hold against an Ottoman army of overwhelming numerical superiority. The Battle of Calugarini became, in subsequent generations, a textbook example of using terrain, flexible defense, and tactical intelligence to neutralize numerical disadvantage. His use of combined arms, integrating infantry, cavalry, artillery, and irregular fighters in coordinated tactical systems, was sophisticated even by Western European standards of the era. His understanding of logistics and supply was genuinely advanced. He knew that an army that could not be supplied could not fight, and he consistently targeted Ottoman supply lines. His campaigns contributed to a broader degradation of Ottoman military capacity in the Balkans during the Long Turkish War. The losses suffered in the 1595 campaign were serious. The political impact was greater than the purely military one. Ottoman invincibility had been demonstrated to be a myth. Diplomatically, Michael's most important achievement was demonstrating that the Romanian principalities could function as active agents in European politics rather than passive objects. His establishment of direct relationships with the Habsburg court, the papacy, and other Christian rulers elevated Wallachhia's status to a recognized player in the anti-Ottoman coalition. His brief unification of Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia established a precedent and, more importantly, a vision. The idea that these three Romanian-speaking principalities could and should be united became a powerful political concept, one that resonated for the next 3 centuries. When the modern Romanian state was being built in the 19th century, Micheal the Brave was the foundational historical figure that Romanian nationalists pointed to as the proto-unifier. The unification of 1859 and the formation of modern Romania in 1881 were consciously understood as the completion of what Micheal had begun. He became, in Romanian national mythology, roughly equivalent to figures like William Wallace or Joan of Arc, the symbol of national resistance and aspiration. From the Ottoman perspective, Micheal's campaigns represented one of the more serious reversals of the empire's Balkan expansion. The long-term consequence was not the loss of territory, but the establishment of a precedent that Christian resistance could be effective. The Long Turkish War, in which Micheal's campaigns were a significant component, ended in the Treaty of Zitvatorok in 1606. This was the first time the Ottoman Empire had concluded a peace with the Habsburgs on terms of rough equality rather than Ottoman superiority. Micheal's campaigns did not cause this by themselves, but they were part of the broader military and political dynamic that led to it. More broadly, the 1590s marked the beginning of the end of Ottoman territorial expansion into Central Europe. The empire would remain dominant in southeastern Europe for a long time, but the era of seemingly unlimited westward advance was closing. The Battle of Kalugareni and the campaigns that followed were part of the reason. Step back to the widest possible view. What did Micheal the Brave's life and campaigns mean in world historical terms? He was a critical node in one of history's most consequential fault lines, the boundary between the Ottoman Islamic world and Christian Europe. For the better part of 2 centuries, that boundary had moved steadily westward as Ottoman power expanded. The generation of rulers who fought the Long Turkish War, of whom Micheal was perhaps the most remarkable individual, contributed to stopping and then beginning to reverse that expansion. The preservation of the Romanian principalities as Orthodox Christian entities had long-term consequences. The eventual Romanian state that emerged in the 19th century was a direct product of this survival. Romania today, its language, its culture, its Orthodox faith, these exist in the form they do partly because Micheal the Brave and people like him held the line. He was also a figure of extraordinary personal significance in the broader story of resistance against imperial power. A man born without clear legitimacy, who climbed through intelligence and will to the highest position available to him, who then used that position to fight for his people. There is something universal in that story that transcends the specific geography and time period. He was not perfect. He was ruthless when ruthlessness served his purposes. The massacre of the Ottoman creditors in 1594 was brutal. His management of the Romanian peasantry, while better than most rulers of his era, was still that of an absolute prince in a pre-modern world. His expansionism, driven partly by genuine vision and partly by the logic of survival, created its own victims. But measure him by the standards of his time and his circumstances, and what emerges is one of the most remarkable figures of the late Renaissance. A soldier, a statesman, a spy master, and a visionary, all rolled into one. A man who saw further than his contemporaries, moved faster than his enemies expected, and changed the map of Eastern Europe through sheer force of intelligence and will. In 1599, when Micheal rode into Alba Iulia as ruler of Transylvania, a contemporary observer wrote that the crowd stretched as far as the eye could see. People had come from across the principality, Romanians, Hungarians, Saxons, to see the man who had done the impossible. Not because they all agreed with him, not because they all loved him, but because they recognized that they were watching something rare, a person who had bent the world rather than being bent by it. He held unified rule for less than 3 months. He was dead within 2 years. And yet 400 years later, his face is on Romanian currency. His name is on streets and schools and military academies. The moment of unification he created is honored as a national holiday. The equestrian statue of Micheal the Brave stands in the center of Bucharest, sword raised, looking south toward the Danube and the empire beyond. Some legacies outlast the men who made them, and some men, imperfect, complicated, driven by equal parts ambition and conviction, leave marks on the world that no amount of time can fully erase. Micheal the Brave was one of those men. History is full of figures who briefly achieve something extraordinary before being brought down by betrayal, politics, or the sheer weight of the forces against them. Micheal unified 3 nations, won battles he should have lost, and died in a tent 6 days after his greatest victory. Do you think he knew what he was building would outlast him? Or was he simply a man who lived and fought for the present moment, and the legacy came later? Leave your answer below. This is the conversation I'm here for. Thank you. Genuinely, thank you for spending 2 hours with me on this story. If you made it this far, you know that Micheal the Brave is not a household name in most of the world. And that feels like an injustice that history documentaries have a responsibility to correct. If this video helped you see that, then share it. Tell someone. Let his story spread a little further. This channel exists because of people who care about the deep stories, the complicated, brilliant, brutal, inspiring human beings who shaped the world we live in, but whose names never made it into mainstream history books. If that is you, subscribe. There are more stories coming. Big ones. I'll see you in the next one.